All right, and we're back. Super excited to be sitting here with Colin Kelley of Merida Capital. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, really excited to be able to explore a little bit about your history, which goes back pretty far here in Minnesota. And then also talk a little bit about some of the projects that you're working on here, both in Minnesota, but also around the country. Really some exciting stuff. But first, take us a little bit about your background. Prior to 2015 here in Minnesota, what was some of the things that you were working on? Obviously not cannabis related, but just generally.
Sure. Yeah, that I excuse me. I always refer to those days as my pre-cannabis days. So BC, before cannabis.
I love
that. I'd worked in a lot of software startups, artificial intelligence software startups. I even tried my hand at investment banking and found out that not only was I not very good at it, but I also really didn't like it at all.
Gotcha.
It's just way too structured, and they weren't my people. I'd done some other consulting for other groups, kind of helping set up and start not only businesses, but also kind of new sectors within industries, right? So a lot of it could have been supply chain, could have been other, different things like that. So that was some of my background, right? Kind of, I knew I was a business-oriented person, so to speak. So then I had the fortune of actually I was at I think it might have been like a cocktail party, probably one that I had no business being at, right? I mean, I didn't quite crash it, but it was
Those are the best ones to be at.
Close, yeah. And it was the summer. The law had just gotten passed for medical in Minnesota, but the applications hadn't even dropped yet. And so I happened to be at this event.
Sounds familiar.
Right, 14. 14, summer 14. So bumped into some folks who were emergency room physicians practicing, and they were kind of talking about how they were really fed up with prescribing opiates and other medications that they thought were really damaging to people's health, and felt like they didn't have a lot of other options. And so they were saying, hey, we want to apply for a license here, a medical license in Minnesota. And they said, maybe you want to help us, write a little piece of the application since you do quote unquote startups.
Okay.
Yeah. And I said, oh yeah, sure. Yeah, no big deal. Sounds great. I'll do that. Let me know. And so I helped them out a little bit. But really I didn't think anything of it. And then I got a phone call in December of 2014. And they said, well, we won.
Okay.
And then they said, we have a group, because each of the applicants, you got a lot more points if you had kind of consultants from outside the state who had been successful in, setting up a cannabis program before.
For sure.
Right. So I think Kyle Kingsley's group, Vireo, is now Goodness Growth. They had partnered maybe with a group out of Colorado or something like that. And I think the Leafline group had looked at other medical states, and Connecticut was one of there weren't that many at that point.
For sure.
Right. And Connecticut had passed. So they found a group that had scored very well in Connecticut, scoring and had them consulting. And, but the story was, hey, we don't have any folks on the ground in Minnesota, and this could be another startup for you. What do you think?
That's really cool.
Yeah, that's incredible. So I've had the opportunity to look through the PowerPoint, mind you, a slightly redacted version, but that was presented to the state of, here's sort of our general proposal, our general plan on property. Right. And looking at that partnership, that was an essential part. And I think they were like the highest scoring applicant out of their state. So a good person to partner with.
Yeah. Yeah. They definitely, knew what they were doing. They had been, they had done work in Colorado and Nevada as well. Excuse me. So they were a good group and had expertise in different areas, which was very helpful for us. And,
at that point, how familiar were you with cannabis at that age?
Not very.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. So you get this call and it's like, hey, so we got the license. We're starting up our business. What was your, I mean, clearly you said yes at some point, but what was your reaction to that?
Well, so, it actually had been, I quickly had a flashback to my mom, who's like a 5th grade teacher who taught DARE, a DARE in her classroom. She still is a DARE teddy bear in her living room.
Okay.
So I had that quick moment of thought, and then I said, well, yeah, of course. And then I called the employer that I had at the time, which was a software company. And I was like, yeah, so I quit. Yeah, that was it. It just seemed pretty exciting.
And what role did they offer you at that time?
At that time, it was chief operating officer.
Wow.
And then we added chief financial officer to that, which is it's a pretty challenging mixture. So we had to really build a great team of people who could like fill a lot of gaps, right? Like somebody strong in compliance, a strong like controller that knew accounting better, upside down and sideways, right?
Do you have any idea like what the ambition of the size that they were going for, what they were allowed to go for right off the bat?
Right off the bat, it was super limited. I think it was 4 locations, maybe 5 locations, in terms of like the retail fronts that they were allowed to have.
Sure.
Yeah. Today we have a slightly expanded version, but I still think it's capped at 8 per business.
Right. It was tied to congressional districts.
Yeah.
So at the time, the number one point getter could choose odd or even number congressional districts.
Interesting. Okay. Totally.
And so that was Vireo, and they chose whatever one had Minneapolis in it, right? And so they chose that one. And then, we had the other set of congressional districts. And so you had to put one in each of those. And it's a great way, gerrymandering aside, right? It's a great way to spread out access to medicine. Sure. I mean, it would be nice if they had said you must put 4 in each congressional district, right? I mean, I think that was a limiting factor for the program early on was, access points to the medicine was one of the issues, but
it's just so interesting to hear like 10 years later, we're talking about how many plants we can grow. And it's like different problem, but same kind of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I do appreciate that Minnesota, they did a couple things well when they set up the program, I think, was one, they made it kind of like a research study. So the Department of Health collected all the data, and they actually sat down with each company and went over it every quarter and looked at like, where are the outliers in terms of dosage, and, and they gave surveys out to the patients about, am I feeling better or worse, or, and so I think that type of data is important to have, and it certainly goes further improving what we already know about cannabis, right? And they also didn't limit canopy or plant size. So that was great. I think the limit was, financially what you could outlay, right? I mean, there was even less access to capital in 2015 than there has been in the last few years. So, you pay cash for a building, and you have to, there are also not many communities that would allow you to be there, right?
Yeah, I remember it being news when the city council approved, like, the grow can come in. Like, finally we found the place that it's allowed.
Yeah. And so a lot of times it would push you pretty far outside the metro, which then also became an issue staffing, right? Because you want high quality, folks, and there are high quality folks all over the state of Minnesota, but we need 50 of them.
Yeah. So take us through what some of like the early days of essentially this startup company was like. Was it similar to other startups that you had worked at in the past, or is cannabis its own unique beast?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what I do love, that it's still, my opinion is it's still so early. And in 2015, it was very early. And so there's a lot of creative problem solving that still gets to occur, because there's not necessarily like the way.
Fair.
There are a bunch of ways.
Yeah.
Okay. And I can appreciate that, right? There are a number of different ways to grow cannabis even, right? And they all grow good quality cannabis. So wonderful. You just have to pick one.
and so go-to-market strategy, where's the war room? Where are you like building before everything gets built?
Yeah. So when we did the application, usually you're in like a law firm kind of office for a while, and there was, the applications were so massive. Ours was like 3,500 pages or something, and you needed X amount of physical copies, and we actually set the copier on fire at the law firm, and we had to like pay for it later. So
that's incredible. I mean, the true power of regulation.
Right? Yeah, like even the copier, even the machine, the inanimate object said like, no, this is ridiculous. But we found our cultivation and manufacturing and offices were to be in Cottage Grove, kind of near, Renewal by Anderson in that area down, and so but it was an alfalfa field when we got it. So there was a lot of site work, and then you had to build and whatnot. And we knew so what we did, we brought in a bunch of temporary buildings and, put them all together. There were like 8 trailers, and we put them together so they made one giant room. And then we kind of dextered the whole inside with plastic sheeting, right? And attached, an HVAC to it, plunked a security guard down in the front, and she was never allowed to leave for like 4 months. And that was the temporary grow where we did all of our starts.
Wow.
And like we grew there, and we had our first harvest in there, because the state was very, very explicit, and we were all very fearful. They gave licenses in December, and they said, you shall have a dispensary open and make your first sale on July 1st, or we'll take your license and give it to the next person in line. And that includes growing.
Can we talk about some other like ridiculous things that they told you?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I definitely will. Yeah. But anyway, we had a little office, like an office in St. Paul Park. That was like, I remember when the wind blew, the curtains like moved, and it was like pretty sad and sketchy.
East side.
East, yeah.
A lot of activity on the east side.
On the east side, and St. Paul, as well, and so we built the permanent facility, had our first harvest, and then we're able to transition a lot of the clones and the other plants into the veg rooms, and like really ready to start going. And we had the extraction room was commissioned first, so we could run the extractor before the rest of the building was commissioned.
Okay.
To actually start to get the medicine.
Because
going.
For people who don't know or maybe don't remember, you couldn't sell the raw flower at the time.
No
it
flower.
Had to be in a processed form. Yeah.
Only in processed form, and it had to be CO2 extraction, which at the time the yields were okay, but like it took a long time. And the size of the machines, I mean, they were like really small machines, so you could only process a few pounds at a time, right? And so this became a big issue, and the state had, you had to register, and this was a big issue for I think all the medical companies for the first several years.
Yeah.
One was that you had to register a product. And so they had to approve said product. And then in order for that and then you could never run out of it. And if you ran out of it, they could shut you down. They could shut the dispensary down. They could shut you down for days on time. They could fine you like tens and thousands of dollars and whatnot.
Which medicinally makes sense on the principle of this is medicine. We don't want the patients to run out of their medicine.
But there wasn't a substitution. And so they also, what they defined as a product then became a challenge, right? So they said, you have to be within, 3% of all the cannabinoids in everything. And which is even more precise than say like Advil and Tylenol is like 10%, right? Okay. 3%, whatever. We have scientists. They're very smart. They can figure this out, right? So they could get that. The issue became, when you have, let's say, a higher THC vape cartridge, right, that has a tiny little bit of CBD in it, but the CBD had to be within 3%. And when you start with, whatever, like 1%, so like the margin for error on those like tail cannabinoids was so great that it just became this huge hassle.
I'm trying to, so like hypothetically, like tangerine, like to being a type of oil, like you always have to have the exact same, not just percentage and ratios, but like down to even the minor cannabinoids and making sure that they're all in the exact range.
Because 3% of 1% is not very much.
Mm-hmm. It's tiny and tiny, you know? And like, and guess what? It's a plant.
Yeah, totally.
Right? So each, like even in within one harvest, a different part of the room could produce a different amount of like CBD.
Yeah.
Right? Never mind.
And we're picking on CBD, but you're saying all the minor cannabinoids involved in the product.
It did. And we finally got them to like not worry about those and just go with THC and CBD, but it still became a challenge. You know, we had, you know, the higher CBD medications too, that the ratio, the margin for error on the THC that was usually at a 20-to-1 ratio, right? With THC being the 1, it still had, it was really hard to get it right.
Sure.
You know?
And you can't run out.
And you can never run out. So then
it sounds like a twisted game.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's crazy thinking how, like, from the consumer standpoint, maybe you go to the dispensary and you're like, why are there only 6 options or whatever be it? But the reason on the business side is because every single one of those needs to always be in stock. And at any point, someone can come in and say, I want this. And you have to go, yep, it's right here. Yeah. That's insane.
It's pretty crazy. And so it did prevent us from having a larger kind of selection of products, because it's, you know, and also we had to come up with a whole process. We developed like a proposal for testing products to say, we have a new product that we want, but again, we don't know if patients want this actual product. So what if we make it and we get it out to all these different dispensaries, and then the patients don't want it, or the patients only want it in one area, right? Like they don't want it in St. Cloud, but they do want it in Hibbing. Wow.
It almost like eliminates all traditional marketing strategy that you would want to
just poof, you know. So that became a big challenge. So we had to work with the state on, you know, kind of like moving some of those standards. We'd say, okay, we know what you're trying to accomplish, and we want to have a continuous supply of safe medicine that's consistent for everybody, and like we have to be able to operate. Like, come on now.
Going back like 6 years ago, 8 years ago, who were some of those people in place? You said the Department of Health. Is that who you interfaced with?
Yeah. Okay. So the Minnesota Department of Health, they had the Cannabis
Office of
OCM, the Office of Cannabis Management. And so we fortunately built good relationships with them, and we could kind of say, okay, you know, you need a memo that revises this, or even some of the testing labs, right, that were not used to testing cannabis. And so, you know, we had to work with them in terms of, you know, what the testing protocol should be and how many samples do you need, and you know,
so
size. And
we've heard a lot of comments from like the hemp regulators of today, where, I mean, frankly, they came to a panel that we did and we're talking about regulations and went, yeah, I don't really know why these are the rules, but this is what the lawmakers passed. So here we go. Yeah. At the time, was there that similar sort of, I mean, frankly, transparency and like, we don't exactly know why this is the rules either, but this is what statute says. So this is how it works, or what were some of those conversations like? I
think initially there was kind of like, well, this is statute and it's really new and it almost didn't pass. So, you know, do you really want to open that up? Because this whole thing could actually get rolled back before it, you know, in a sense. And the companies were, the companies are trying to, you know, financially survive so we can continue to get medicine out there, you know. And so we did have some good conversations. We definitely learned kind of the hierarchy of, you know, there's statute that the legislators, you know, vote on, right? And that's law, and that's really hard to change. Like once a year, really hard to change, and someone can sneak other stuff in there that hurts you. Like hurts the industry, hurts patients, hurts a lot of people, right? Right. And then there's rule. So there's a rules committee. And then usually the regulatory body is, you know, they're 90% of it, but they, you know, they set the rules. And so that's a great way to kind of like get a conversation going and say, hey, like, can we change some of the rules? And usually they'll do that, you know, once a year. They'll kind of start to modify the rules or tweak them to make just things work better. And they were they were open to those conversations. And then in the interim, there's the possibility for memo. So the regulatory body can issue a memo to all the licensees and say, hey, we're changing the standard. The rules say that the testing standard is 3%, but we're changing the testing. If something comprises less than 5% of the total, we're going to change it to 10% variance.
Okay, totally.
And then they would then hopefully make it permanent in rule, like later on that year when they did their whole thing.
Okay.
Right? But it took us a couple years of like very open and honest communication and very much, we couldn't be too industry and they couldn't be too regulator. In those conversations. We really had to take those hats off and say like, hey, look, it did help that it was a medical program. And we could say, hey, we're here. It's a medical program. We're here for patients. Like, let's just keep that goal in mind and we'll figure this stuff out.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Wow. It's cool to sort of hear about the back end side of it, because I think from the patient standpoint, we maybe only see sort of what's put in the store or maybe what the companies put out in social media or whatever be it. Yeah. But hearing about the sort of the restrictions on the state, I was talking to an employee of a Minnesota business. I don't want to put anyone on blast, but a current medical grower. And I was talking about like, God, I'm really a fan of solventless extracts. Like, why don't we have that? That's something I really want. She's like, well, frankly, it's the state. Like, I think we would love to be making it too, but until the Department of Health or the Office of Medical Cannabis says, yeah, patients can do this and we can do it in a consistent way, we're not going to be able to. Right.
And I think early on, and they had it they might have even had it in law early on. I think they were worried about, if you think about the early BHO butane days, right?
Oh yeah.
They were, oh my God, someone's gonna they're gonna blow up half of Cottage Grove. For sure. They're gonna, there's gonna be, kerosene in the cannabis, and like people are gonna die, and there was that type level of fear.
For sure.
Right? And so initially, I think they put it in there, and maybe they felt very noble that it was like a patient safety and product quality, thing, and like the industry has grown so much that there are amazing products out there from, so many different methods of extraction, whether it's, ice water or BHO or
For
ethanol
sure.
or, whatever it is. Right?
Yeah, we were just talking yesterday about sort of the evolution of legalization has really exposed a lot of what we can do with cannabis. That 10 years ago, we didn't really exist. Yeah.
And from a consumer perspective, I left last night so much more clear-headed using the extracts that we were using versus some of the other methods that I've experimented with, right? And it's like,
for sure,
it is really nice to have those fine extracts available because it interacts with our body just much differently and right. in a much clearer way from my experience.
But I'm trying to now picture like a solventless extract, but still needing to get within that 3% variance. I mean, that's a whole other thing. So, well, we're going to take a short break here, but when we get back, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the stuff that you're doing today, both in Minnesota and nationally.
Yeah, great.
Perfect. We'll be right back. All right, and we're back. So tell me a little bit more about from the business standpoint. Sure. I can picture in my mind the newspaper or the TV news headlines when those dispensaries first opened. We had patients coming in, along with a lot of media, showing that people have access to legal cannabis medication.
Yeah.
What was it like? Like, was it? I picture in my mind like working for like a game studio and like your game finally launched and like you're all super proud of it. Was that sort of the feeling of dispensaries open, or was that really sort of when like the stress of business began? I mean, what was it like on the inside?
I mean, it was that race to July 1st to be able to open. It was a big day of celebration. I mean, we definitely, the whole company got together and we were, so ecstatic. I mean, we were almost crying. All of us were so happy.
How from July 1st to when you started, what was that time frame?
So I mean, we started the site work in December, and then got the temporary grow in place in like January, February-ish, right? And did the starts, like got the clones going and the whatnot, and started growing. then started constructing the actual, permanent facility, which I think we commissioned the extraction room in May, which is, we harvested there in May. So there's, 3 or 4 months of 'cause you're growing from a smaller, it's not like you took healthy big clones or something, right? You're earlier, it takes a little longer.
Sure.
So, you would do the cure, we do the extraction, and then we had to, go through the whole, formulation process and decarb. And I think initially our first set of products were, tinctures and, maybe some vape, a couple vape. Yeah. And we're just in the 3, a couple different ratios, a high CBD 1-to-1 and a high THC. And so that was, we're kind of going through that, and we knew that. So from, if you extract and you're now in mid-May and you have 6 weeks left. So then you have, you have to test this. You might have to reformulate,
Okay.
And then, if it's a tincture, you have to decarb it, and then you have to do this. And then if it's, do you want to add terpenes back into the vapes that came off the first run of the CO2, which CO2 is great for that. Actually, you get some really nice actual cannabis terpenes out. So that's lovely. But, so we're kind of okay, this is going to be kind of tight, because then we have to package it all. And it's not like we have big machines to do this. I'm sitting there with a pipette,
Oh,
trying to get very sticky, 100%.
and this is straight startup energy, COO, down there
I'm
filling
in there,
vapes.
filling vapes, bringing in sandwiches on Sundays, and filling vapes, and we, and it's so we didn't use any excipients in the or cutting agents in the vape, so it's really thick.
Oh yeah,
really thick oil, and so you're oh my gosh, how does this, and you're trying to get it right. And then it was also, a time frame when, as an example, you clean a lot of things with ethanol, even in a CO2, lab. It's a great way to do that. However, there was an ethanol shortage nationally.
Okay.
And so, as an example, they're my extraction guy calls me up on a Sunday morning, 7. And he's so we need ethanol. And, and I've been looking for it for weeks all over the country. Couldn't get it anywhere. And I was well, how, what, tell me a little bit about this. Characteristics wise, percentage of alcohol, what do we need? And and I was what about Everclear?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
And he's not the stuff they sell in Minnesota. He's plus it's also Sunday, so you can't buy it in Minnesota yet at that point, right?
Funny.
And he's but yeah, the stronger stuff you could. So I called all the liquor stores in border towns in Wisconsin, and there was one that had more than one bottle. So I show up, and I was yeah, I'm here for the Everclear. And well, how much do you want? I said, no, I'm here for the Everclear, all of it. And I bought 5 cases of handles.
Yeah.
And then a couple more cases of just the, liter bottles.
Wow.
They didn't card me, and they helped me carry it to my car.
Good old Wisconsin.
I know. Good old Wisconsin.
It reminds me of the legislature last year when they were trying to make the point that you could have 1,000 joints, and then Representative Stevenson was well, I can buy enough grain belt for my basement, and it's well, Colin bought enough Everclear to kill Cottage Grove.
Yeah, right. I mean it's amazing. I drove very carefully on the way to Cottage Grove.
Incredible. So one question that I have, and you might not have been part of these conversations, but I think one thing that people have asked about for a while is looking at some of the early genetics that were brought into Minnesota. What was some of the decision making around what cultivars to use? Obviously, from the consumer side, you didn't see Blue Dream. You saw black or orange or whatever. Yeah. But what sort of was the conversation around essentially what is good to grow from that medical standpoint?
And a lot of that, I really think came down to the initial cultivation, consultants and partners that we had, because a lot of them were responsible for kind of picking that initial genetic library.
Very cool.
Also, I mean, we knew that we couldn't, unfortunately we couldn't disclose, right? What it was.
Absolutely.
By law, which really sucked.
Yeah.
However,
no marketing.
Yeah, no marketing, none at all. However, we knew as an extract only market, right? You want something that is, that tests pretty well and yields really high, like per square foot or per plant, right? And probably something that is pretty tasty,
Fair.
right? In the sense that like we could capture, like if you could capture terpenes on an initial extraction run and then add them back into the finished product, like you could at least get that whole plant entourage, essence that people miss when you can't, smoke, let's say, or something like that. Yeah, so that was probably it. I think, the CBD dominant strain that we initially selected was selected specifically for the ratio.
Cool.
So we'd done some work with some pharmacists and understood that 20-1 is an ideal ratio for extreme severe seizure disorders, and so we found a hybrid strain that grew at 20-1.
Okay.
So if we could grow to spec, actually, it was a lot easier on the scientists in the back end.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
I can imagine. So looking for a lesson and essentially relying on expertise to figure out what is going to be able to work in this market, not only from like a functional standpoint, but also just like what's going to make good product.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, the lesson also became, depending on the products that you're producing, you may not need a large or broad selection. Like it actually, that variability actually would hurt the companies in the early days of the Minnesota market. You were punished for having a broad strain selection. So, Leafland had a couple of, high THC strains, and like they had a 1-to-1 strain and they had a high CBD strain. And that was like, those are the production strains. And they had 20 others, in the waiting. But like, we're
if it's working,
it's working. Yeah. And like we'd have to make basically a whole new product.
So the decentrification of bringing more products on kept you from
bringing in those other strains, and some of them are really, really great and like really really tasty, or like had different or interesting terpene profiles. Let's say that were like, oh, this would be great for X.
And so your lineup on July 1st, you've covered vape cartridges. Yep. What else was available?
We had some tinctures. I know we were developing a sublingual spray.
I like sprays.
They're nice because it's a fast acting, if you put them under the tongue. And ours, we had like one that was an orange and it tasted kind of like a dreamsicle.
Sure. And
that was it was really nice because so many of them are like mint, which is great. I like mint. But mint is not for everybody.
Yeah.
And so something that's a little sweeter, quote unquote sweeter, is nice. So we had those products. The dispensary was really tricky. Our Egan one was the one that opened first. And we had paint was drying on the wall that day. I mean, like, and then the vault, the poor gentleman that we hired to like deliver the vault in so we could get approved by the state to operate, he had a health issue and ended up in the hospital. And so like we had to we thought our vault was lost. And like we had to go like contact someone else to get the keys for his business, to like get someone else to like go into his business and deliver the vaults. And then, and they were like, and then like they get there and they're like, oh yeah, these are going to break the floor tiles if we set them down. So what do you do? And then someone went out and got hockey pucks because it's Minnesota, and like you set the vault on these hockey pucks. And
that's so Minnesotan. I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Just got some pucks in Egan,
Yeah, big deal. Pucks supporting all the cannabis product, and
but take us through even why you need a vault. So what was the requirement there?
So it was, I think in modern current day dispensaries in most markets, right? It's you just need a secure area to store it. And eventually, even in Minnesota, we got to, we could have, as long as the room was secure.
Okay.
You could, and you had access controls, and there was like, you couldn't like break through the wall or something. There was like reinforced whatever everywhere else. You could lock it up there. But initially, it had to be in like a safe. Like think like a, gun safe or a money safe or an old Western safe,
Yeah.
which sounds really cool. And I liked it because it was kind of like a movie, except you can't put much stuff in there.
No.
Because this isn't like a huge, like old bank style, like full room safe. This is just like the safe. Like you lock it in there.
Yeah, so we could build a room that you probably could not drive a car through, but we still had to put this like old Western safe, like you're spinning dials and like doing whatever, on it. And it held like, barely enough medicine for the week, so you're like making all these deliveries all the time. And then, God forbid you run out of a product, and then at the time you needed, it might still be the case too, you need at least 2 people to like deliver, right? 2 people and then the manifests. And then, I mean, I don't know, you probably needed, spotter planes with like snipers and stuff at that point. I mean, it's crazy.
I mean, around that same time, Clem was doing his research, and when they went out looking for feral hemp, they had to have a gun safe in the back of their pickup truck. So it's like, it's
God forbid they crash and then like hemp gets out or something.
So that would be tragic. Yeah. I mean, there'd be dead animals and babies everywhere.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's not growing wild throughout all of Minnesota or anything.
Not at all.
For years and years and years.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's like Fort Snelling days. No big deal.
So we've talked a lot about sort of like the first couple of days. Yeah, for real.
They gave it out to the settlers at Fort Snelling.
So I tell this story because I think it's one of the coolest ones ever. And if you go back to like some of the original writings about Fort Snelling, there's literally the records of like the wives of these soldiers tossing bird seed out over the hill. And that was hemp seed that then took root. And like some of the earliest hemp that we had growing in our state was prior to statehood. And it's really been here longer than Minnesota has. But
Right.
Yeah. I love it. So tell us a little bit more about so you've been operating, maybe you get like a year or 2 into business. Obviously, it's no hidden secret that financially that was a tough business to operate. What was it like sort of being the CFO, COO at that time when, I mean, you have so many regulations and chains on your business really sort of preventing like huge success?
When I started Cannabis, I had hair. Right?
Okay.
I don't have hair. I don't have hair now. So if you're listening
That
to
says
this, if you're on YouTube, you get it. But if you're listening to this, I'm,
we're doomed.
It was rough. It was really, really stressful. I mean, there were a couple times I'd pass out at home or something, and my wife would have to drag me up off the floor and ask if I'm okay. So it was really, really stressful. And you layer on all these different whether it's security and regulatory requirements and, fees for this, licensing fees for this and that, and, annual regulatory licensing fees.
I'm sure the tax structure is unlike other
The tax
startups.
structure, the 280E tax structure really sucks. Even, it just does. And then you have the great thing that, there are pharmacists. And this is a great thing, right? Because they're actually like the person you would want dosing anything, right? Like pharmacists are amazing, intelligent folks, and they study the endocannabinoid system. And they're really expensive. And so if you need, and that like line item is, there was probably a year where we spent more on pharmacists than we made in revenue, right? But we had to have them just to be open.
Because for people who maybe haven't been in Minnesota's medical program, let's say your doctor says, you're approved. You get approved by the state. Before you can ever pick up your product, you're meeting with a pharmacist at the dispensary to talk through the different options, to figure out what works best for you. Maybe a couple weeks down the line, you figure, I want to try something different. You're going back to that pharmacist to talk to them again.
And are they in store when you're there?
At least in the past, they have been. Recently, they've switched to where you can call in and have like an online or on-call appointment.
That was a COVID era kind of, they allowed for the remote consultation. But previous to that, it was by law. The pharmacist had to be there meeting with you in person, and they had to push the button, essentially, quote unquote, push the button on every transaction that like ping back to the state's, registry. So, they're there having to like approve everything. And so you really can't make a sale without them. You legally can't be open without them. Patients legally can't make a purchase or get their medicine without them. So they're a great benefit, and they were also a massive cost, especially when, the adoption of medical cannabis in Minnesota was and actually still is very low, very, very slow. One, it was an extract only market, which typically is like 1.1% of population, let's say, but that's still like, we're not even there yet in Minnesota with flower, right? To 1.1% of population, which is wild.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, because it should be, it should have been 50.
Yeah, if
60,
we want patients to be
75,000
using this,
people,
that's
right.
not close.
And we ran into a problem early on. No one knew who could certify them. And the state actually forbid anyone to tell anyone who. So we had a list. We personally, Leafline had a list of, we knew physicians that would certify. We were not allowed to publish or disclose it. So we had to set up a call center, and people could call us, and we could maybe tell them over the phone and direct them to people. But there was no directory of here are physicians. So, and we have a lot of big healthcare groups in Minnesota even,
I mean, a
Fairview
standout amount
and, and all these big.
Right.
Yeah. So you go to, wherever you're at Southdale, and you ask them, and they're like, no, nobody in this whole health system does. Good luck.
For sure.
And so you're kind of you hit a brick wall. So patient enrollment's really low. I actually I hired and built a whole team of people that went out like drug reps to doctors' offices and got them to enroll as certifying physicians. And then we started to go work with typically patient advocacy groups. So go with Epilepsy Foundation and the American Cancer Society and autism groups and things like that.
Wow. That's part of your marketing strategy in a sense.
It became the marketing strategy and really the only one available to us. Yeah.
And I mean, even last year I heard people saying, I can't find a good doctor to go to, or I only have to go, I'm in this network, I can't find a doctor.
For sure. I have a very clear memory of having a good friend of mine dealing with intractable pain at the time and going to TRIA and having a wonderful doctor. So not at all a knock on the doctor, but the doctor, saying, we've tried a lot of different things. Maybe you can try hypnosis or things that are more of on the mental side. And she's like, well, I'd really like to try cannabis. Sorry, we don't prescribe that here. Yeah. And just thinking about being in this appointment where the doctor is saying, cannabis, no, I'm sorry, that doesn't have medical value right now. But hypnosis, that might. And I'm not knocking either of those, not knocking the doctor, but just thinking about, wow, being at a time where cannabis was that neglected. And
it's amazing. And it was really expensive for patients. It still is.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the annual certification or registration fee is still, I think, exorbitant.
So thankfully here in Minnesota, they've gotten rid of that. But that was, 2 months, very, very recently.
Within months.
Yeah.
Right?
Going back, so the same friend back in 2015 was looking at spending about $250 to get a doctor to say, we'll approve you. And then another, I think $200 with the state. Yeah. Insane. So you're already spending, $500 before you even walk into the dispensary. And then you're looking at, all right, maybe I want to try this vape product, and it's $100.
Yeah. Yeah. So you had half-gram vapes at $70, let's say, or $75. And quite frankly, at first, I think, benchmarked at a price per cannabinoid. So if you looked at it, it was on par with some other markets on a per milligram of THC level, but it also was still really expensive. And then even as those markets, they saw price compression, thankfully, which is great, right? And so they went from 20 cents per milligram of THC down to, 10 or 9 or 7 or whatever, right? Minnesota didn't really budge, and didn't really have room to. Yeah, right? They're kind of this is where we're at, and we're, each company's losing, it was well documented. There are all these articles. Right?
For sure, yeah.
$2 million a year, $3 million a year. And
God, who's that CFO?
I know,
well,
right?
Well, and I think the biggest thing that we saw in those other states is sort of that continual ramp up of more patients being enrolled, this expansion of the program. And at least for those first few years in Minnesota, there was that initial peak and then nothing.
Flat.
We saw maybe a new condition get approved, and then you'd see a minor peak. But until intractable pain was added, you never saw any expansion of that. Yeah. And I imagine from the scaling of a business side, you're already having to supply all these products. You're already having to make sure that you have this. And now your consumer base is not growing at all.
Yeah. And you're in it. I mean, you spent cash for your building, you know, so you're, you know, land, building, all the grow lights, right? Like tables, HVAC. And then, you know, if you think about like electricity for a, you know, if you have a home grow, it's a home grow, right? Or like if you're growing in your garage, like, you know, it's tough, but you notice the bump in your bill, right? Even with LED, you know, but this was early on. So this was like HPS, like high pressure sodium.
Okay.
So big electricity draw. I mean, you're talking 15, 20 grand a month.
And you can't write that off.
You can't write it off. You've got, you know, 15, 20 grand in testing a month. You've got this and this and this and this and this. And then you have, you know, in order to formulate products and actually get it within these variances, I mean, you need some PhDs kicking around, right?
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, they're not cheap, and like, and, you know, and a lot of them are really lovely people, and we'd like them to stick around. So we, you know, we're like, okay, we got to find benefits for these folks and, you know, and treat them like, you know, the amazing human beings they are.
Yeah. Thinking about the entire infrastructure before even a patient walks in the door that first day. Like insane to think about.
It's pretty amazing. Right. Yeah. So those kind of cost structures, the regulatory cost structures, the, you know, you have to have all these different cameras, right? So like, you know, even to this day, if I'm building a new dispensary somewhere in the country, like I have to budget $150,000 for like cameras and access control.
Yeah.
You know,
at the Canna Connect panel, I think you brought up AWS server costs.
Yeah. So they, you know, every state will tell you how long you have to archive the security footage, right? And so usually it's such a high resolution because they want you to be able to like zoom in, they want it to be color, they want, you know, blah, blah, blah. I get it. And come on now. But I digress. And then, you know, I said, but if it's 60 or 90 days or more, right? Like that, those are like terabytes upon terabytes of data, because video takes up a ton of room, and there's usually audio with it too. And in some states you have to. So it's like video with a full audio, blah, blah, blah. Like, you know, like your server costs are insane.
Yeah. I had a good friend of mine that was working at a medical dispensary out of Oregon when they switched over to adult use. And their business was looking at like, well, is this like a step that we want to take transitioning over? Yeah. And at the time, medical dispensaries didn't have to have the constant surveillance, but adult use did. Ooh. And so this retail store was looking at spending, I think it was like $80,000 at the time, just for their retail store to make sure that you have the infrastructure in place for regulators to look and say, yeah, you're following the law.
Yeah.
It's insane to think about.
No one has stole that vial of product that has never killed a human being in like thousands of years of documented use. You know, yeah.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and when we get back, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that.
Because it is such an uphill battle. The stories you tell, it's such an uphill battle. I mean, in the back of my mind, I'm like, what are we even doing? Like, this is going to be really hard.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I think traditional market has seen that, right? I mean, those folks have fought for decades on decades through prohibition and everything else. And like, they did the battle, right? And and there's still battles happening, you know? And so the good news is now it's like, hey, guess what? Traditional market folks, like, you know, you have legacy market folks, you have backups here, you know?
Yeah.
And so if other people, and we see this a lot, I think in society in general, like the different people have different like platforms, and they have different levels of you know, like privilege and agency and whatnot. And so like, if someone in our like really broad cannabis community has like privilege and a platform and a voice,
for
like,
sure,
let's frickin' like use it. Let's all like get behind it. Like, instead of like, we could either shoot them down so then they never get that message out there, you know, or we could say, like I might not necessarily actually even agree with you on a lot of things, but there are some things we do. And
we've talked before about how like for a long time, there was sort of like the weight that was medical, and then there was sort of the rest of us as the industry down here, be it hemp, be it legacy, whatever, be it. And I think moving into this next chapter of legalization, people are so much more aware of the idea that it's not like that was never the structure of how, like that was set up artificially by law. We're all these pillars of the industry. There's medical, there's adult use, there's low potency, there's all of it. And I think the sooner that we as an industry recognize that and say like, hey, you can say that we've got these two behemoths and fight against them, or you can say, this is our industry. How can we grow this together and really help to expand cannabis access?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really wasn't, that was definitely something that kind of stuck with me a lot through the whole process was like, okay, it felt like everyone hated us. Mm-hmm. And like, I didn't pick there to be 2 licenses.
Totally.
You know, like, I mean, you can make arguments for limited licensing, but like, I'm talking limited licensing as in like, oh, maybe we need 10 medical licenses, you know, from the start, and like 200 dispensaries. You look at like Missouri. Mm-hmm. Missouri I think they over-licensed cultivation square footage for medical. So they gave out like 60 licenses at 30,000 square feet per license for a state of like 4 or 5 something million people.
Okay,
right?
gotcha.
So it's like, it's a little too much canopy for that many people licensed, right? And so a lot of licenses had to learn the hard way that some of them had to like shut down rooms and like, you know, scale back their cultivation because like they're like, like the wholesale price in Missouri went from like went from $3,200 to $1,200. Yeah. So like some of these companies are like, wait, my business model works at like $1,800, not $1,200. I'm like getting crushed. Yep. However, like Missouri put out 200 dispensaries, and they gave you bonus points if you were like the only one in your congressional district or like whatever. So you could be out, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are tons of access points for cannabis in Missouri. They didn't tax it, you know, for medical, right? There was like a state sales tax or something that went to like a fund that then they gave to charities. I was like, okay, this is nice. This is nice. That state with 5 million people had 300,000 medical patients.
5 million, 300,000.
Yeah, that's twice. So Michigan is twice the size of Missouri, and when they went rec, they had 300,000 medical patients. So they had twice the adoption. It was like it had a adoption rate closer to Oklahoma.
Wow, that's crazy to think about.
Yeah,
like. And I've heard it described as like, this is the conservative libertarian approach to legalization is, you know, if you guys figure it out. Yeah. But it's interesting seeing that adoption rate being so drastically different between 2 markets that otherwise relatively similar.
Yeah, relatively similar. Even similar in that there are a couple cities that make up a large portion of the population centers, right? And then, you know, the rest of the population is pretty distributed, right? It's not barren, but it's distributed.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating.
So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about, you could describe it, I guess, as the tail end of your interaction with Leafline. But first I want to talk a little bit about that transition from CFO, COO to the board member. What was it like to go from, I work for this business to now essentially on paper, I'm helping to run it. This is sort of.
Yeah. And, you know, I think, fortunately, the transition was relatively easy. I had the fortune to be, you know, kind of the honor and sometimes the burden of being on a number of different cannabis boards. Okay, you know, now it's
now after that experience.
Yeah, after that experience. Yeah, fortunately, something. But we, you know, the company had grown to a certain point, but instead of adding more executive staff, right? So we actually had a board that took a pretty active role. So like I kept an office there and was there every day.
Okay.
You know, totally. and there were other board members that were there almost every day, you know, having more day-to-day kind of roles. And we had really great folks that had come up through the company and kind of like grown with the company. And we knew that, you know, the market was expanding. We were okay, like flower is on the horizon. We might actually get it passed, or, you know, there were things that were like, okay, there's still things to do that can really like help this program, right?
Clear runway for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was nice to be in a position where I could be up at like 30,000 feet and look at like the whole industry, and also the whole industry, and like look at the rest of the country and see like what's going on there, what might happen here, right? And then also dive into like the details of, you know, all the different transactions at like the St. Cloud dispensary, and like, okay, you know, how many items were in each basket, and like what items were purchased together versus alone. And, you know, what is that? Like, you know, so you can go zoom in, zoom out. It's really great. I think as a CFO for Leafline, I already had kind of like a legal fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, which, you know, is something that is, it adds like a weight in that, like, quite frankly, like if you do something that is deemed negligent, like all the investors get to sue you.
Gotcha.
You know?
So it's not just like you get the bad performance review.
It's not like you get fired, like you get sued.
Okay.
So that was, and then the same thing as a board member. When you're a board member, again, like if you practice poor business judgment or, you know, and or are negligent, like the investors can sue you. Yeah. So we had always been focused on the patients, and I really appreciated that, right? Like, okay, if we do right by them, the business thing will work out, you know, and we'll get more people in the program, the pile will get bigger,
for sure,
whatever. Right. And now I also had this like, and we have a bunch of people that put a bunch of money in. The program didn't grow as fast as you wanted it to. And somehow they have to get their money back, or they're going to be so pissed that they're going to sue me.
I mean, that sounds like fun.
It's great. It's great.
I'm just thinking like this is a movie, you know, like this has all the makings of like happy on the front side, scary on the back side, figure out how to play the balance in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, really tricky. And then, you know, private companies are tricky too, right? So it's not like if you had, you know, we had a lot of investors that were Minnesotans, and they might have been like, they were business leaders and, you know, whatever, doctors and like, I don't know, real estate agents. They were just like, you know,
upper class,
people.
but not exorbitantly rich.
They weren't, you know, on any Forbes lists or anything like that, right? Sure. They weren't, you know.
Jay-Z missed out on the Leafline.
He totally screwed that up. Yeah.
So how did you, I mean, it's interesting. So how long were you on the board before you started? And I mean, let's just get into it. I mean, how did those dealings with GTI evolve?
Okay. Yeah. So I'll go into as much detail as I can.
For sure. Yeah.
Right. Knowing that, you know, there's some I can't.
You might get sued.
Because I might get sued even now. I think we got to a certain point in the company's growth and even the cannabis industry, right? Where, you know, there are big splashy deals, but then also you're seeing some companies grow through acquisitions. So if you look at, like, as an example, you know, by 2020, like Verano had made, you know, whatever, for sure, 17 or 20 transactions, and had gone from like a very small MSO to like the third largest or fourth largest MSO in the country. And you could even argue that some of the transactions that they made, they were probably like, oh, that's a really good deal. Like, that's a nice, like, it's a nice market. Like, you know, and I mean, I don't know how, I don't know how
stocks back in the day.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, plus you have all these investors that might sue you at any moment. Right. So I think there's this whole point where it's like, okay, people are finding value in cannabis, right? And other cannabis companies are finding value in other smaller cannabis companies. Like, they want to, you know, there are only 2 licenses in Minnesota. They might want to be here, you know? Yeah. And, you know, quite frankly, you know, so I could like try to pay my investors back so they don't sue me, or by, you know, sending them a dividend check, you know, every quarter for the next, you know, 3 decades. Right. But then who knows how long that takes, and how long, you know, what happens to the market, or if there's an apocalyptic event, or, you know, whatever. Absolutely, right. Yeah. Yeah. Or it, you know, gets legalized, and then like, what does that happen? You know, like, who the heck knows? It's just too many unknowns. And so, you know, probably the best bet for like investors getting paid back is some type of a transaction, you know, probably a good bet.
I mean, a lot of businesses don't get sold in general, right?
A lot of them don't.
But if you have the ability to, it's probably the best way to get your money back.
And if that's your goal, right? Like, and we can talk about this in a few minutes about kind of my post Leafline work, right? Because they're like different people are involved in cannabis businesses for different reasons, and some of them are like, this is my family business, and I'm gonna, and like, but it's also might be just like 5 of them that put in money, and they're like, we're all gonna run this, and it's gonna be our thing, and then we're gonna give it to our kids or something, right? And some people are like, you know what, like, I get to do some good, and I get to make some money, so win-win, right? It's better than like, buying Amazon stock, right?
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
More interesting, and like, it makes them feel a little better at night,
Because at the end of the day, you're providing medicine to people that need it. That's like actually, a pretty cool business to be part of. Yeah.
It's a good thing. So, so I think, I can't say a lot about the details of that whole process. Like, I knew a lot of, other folks in the cannabis industry that could potentially acquire Leafline, and I'm.
What were your stores called at the time?
They were called Leafline Labs.
Leafline?
Yeah, they were called Leafline. I think they were Leafline Labs, and then we were dropping the labs to just be Leafline.
Okay.
And then I think, post-acquisition, GTI's renamed them Rise. Right? That's their one of their big retail brands. So without, I don't want to get into any of the details of the transaction, but what I will say, like, some takeaways for me from that whole process, and then other subsequent transactions that I've been a part of. A transaction, especially a larger transaction, but really most transactions, even if it's like $10 million, or one dispensary for $5 million or something, or just like a license for $200,000, right? Like, they can take time. So a big transaction where you have, maybe a full vertical or something like that in a state, like, that could take a year. That could take longer, right? Because there's all this, paperwork, and all lawyers have to make their money, right? And they get paid by the hour. So, it takes a while.
So are they cheap?
It's the cheap.
Just like pharmacists, right?
No big deal. No big deal. Yeah. So, the lawyers have to make their money. There's a lot of back and forth, the particulars of the deals and whatever. And like, do you get paid in cash or stock, or do you get paid in a combination of cash and stock? And like, if you get paid in stock, like, when can you sell the stock? Do you have to hold on to it for 6 months? Do you have to hold on to it for a year? Do you hold back, like oftentimes deals will have an escrow kind of like holdback. So 10% of it will be held back in case like any shenanigans happen. And then, the parties can, pull from that pool to cover the said shenanigans. Usually it doesn't happen, but it just is like a good safety net, right? So that's very common.
Sure.
And that can be, I think standard in the cannabis industry is like 10 to 15% of the deal for, somewhere between 12 to 18 months.
Shenanigan fund.
Yeah. They really should call it shenanigan fund, because that is much more telling. Yeah. It's fun to say.
I don't know. I would imagine the numbers weren't public as it's a private company.
Right.
But given the a number of deals that you've been a part of since then, where does this deal rank as far as large, small as deals you've been a part of?
Yeah. It was a good deal. It was cool. Yeah. It was a good deal. I mean, it's it's a full vertical. So, you have your cultivation, you have your manufacturing, and you had, we were in the process, we had just gotten approved for 8 dispensaries. So we were, we had opened Wilmer, and we were looking at like Mankato and some other spots. So it was, it was a growing market. You still had, you knew that whomever acquired said company, right, could then, potentially you had flower, which was probably going to increase sales, and you had adult use on the horizon, maybe someday that would increase sales potentially if you're able to participate.
Did you take any time off afterwards? Like, were you able to relax a little bit before you got into the next thing?
Well, I was already working at Merida. So I was already a partner at Merida when I was a board member at Leafline.
Okay.
And so
So you'd caught the eye of the cannabis industry. You'd done a good enough job, and because Merida is the largest private equity cannabis-based fund in North America, or the world potentially.
I guess so, or one of the largest. Yeah, so it's, I mean, we're 4, 5 funds. We've probably deployed like 380, $400 million, and have like 90 something portfolio companies that range from like grow generation and growing supplies to like new frontier data to actual licenses in different markets and like everything in between. And
I was having coffee with you a couple months ago, and I was like, "So, what's your bandwidth this spring?" And you're like taking me through all the licenses that you're either a part of or that you're overseeing, and it's like you're in 7 different states throughout the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Like your life is a little crazy.
It's nuts. It is pretty nuts. But to me, it's really exciting. Because I get to see, having been part of Minnesota, kind of kicking off. And I get to see that in a number of different markets. So I get to go early before licenses are even out sometimes and meet a lot of great people. And then also, help build companies. And that's the thing with Merida. They've it was, founded, 6 years ago or so. And so, I got connected to them pretty early on, actually. I've known some of the principals, like, before Merida was a thing, right? Just from the industry. And so when I moved to that board role at Leafline, I was fortunate enough, to say, okay, now I can also go do some stuff at Merida, not have this, kind of perceived conflict, right?
Absolutely, that makes sense.
And especially if it's out of the state, so then I could do things in other markets and it's, part of the transaction with Dharma Pharmaceuticals, which was one of the 5 licensees, vertical licensees in Virginia. And that was actually also sold to GTI also in 2001.
21.
21. Yeah, sorry, yeah. 21. So, 2021.
An early operator in this state.
Yeah.
21.
It's like Dukes of Hazzard style. No, 21. So, yeah, it's you kind of get to go see a lot of different markets, and that's what we've seen some of these transactions that they take a lot of time, and there's also kind of there's the need to pair the company with an acquirer that there's certain things that have to match, and it's nice if the culture can be the same, but that's not always possible, right? However, certainly, let's say if you're a cultivator, you probably want to find somebody else that grows similarly to you. So let's say if you're a cultivator, but you have, your greenhouse, your greenhouse cultivator or a sun-grown, right? GTI is not going to buy you.
Gotcha, totally. That makes sense.
Not. Yeah. I don't know exactly, but I'm pretty sure that GTI and Cresco, I don't think they have outdoor grows in their portfolio.
And is that from the background, would you have to guess from, we've been in the business long enough to know that sort of this is the preferred way of growing?
Or you kind of get that sense from them. Or there's some MSOs or some acquirers that, they want, they like to kind of build a brand portfolio, and there are some that want to do it all in-house. So if you have a strong brand portfolio in your company, and don't sell it to, because if you go to somebody who likes to build in-house, they're going to value your brands at 0. Okay. So you get no extra dollars for something that you might have built that's really special, right? Versus somebody that likes to build a brand portfolio of great consumer brands. They're like, oh my gosh, this is great. I will pay a premium for this company because they have this really cool brand.
Is it fun to be in the industry at a time when there's really not a set rule book of here's exactly how you have to run a business?
It's the best.
Okay.
It's the best. Yeah. Because it's to me, it's creative problem solving. It's I think I said this at the Canna Connect panel that I did. I believe in cannabis. A wrong decision is better than a no decision. And that requires a very short feedback loop. So I had a big whiteboard in my office, And it was like every Monday we would make a whole decision set of like, here's what we're going to do this week. And here's how we're going to measure everything that we're doing this week. And the next Monday we would come back and we'd look at the measures. And we're like, okay, that was great. Let's do those things. That was great. Do it again. And we had a whole list of like, don't do that again, stupid. Okay. And like, we wrote it down. And like, to me, you know, like if you do that, if you make the same mistake several times, like that's unforgivable. But like, if you're not making any mistakes, that's also unforgivable.
Okay. Well, and you said that you brought this book in for us to take a look at here in the studio, right? Like the rules, the things that.
Oh, the
no,
rules, yeah, the playbook. The playbook, yeah.
But I mean, on that note, and I know we're a little short on time, but like knowing what you know about us, do you have any advice for what we're doing as far as like early on and media and not really being plant touching yet, but you know, maybe aspirationally? Do you have any advice for us?
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. I think being self-aware and continuing to be self-aware, right? Like what do you want to get from this while you're in it? And like where it's going, you know, do you want to stay with it? Do you not? Right? Like what does that look like for you, each of you personally? Right? I think that's really important. Right? I think also understanding really, really sharply, like where's the value add of what you're doing, like now, right? So, you know, Minnesota Cannabis College, amazing, right?
Appreciate it.
Yeah. You know, I think the conversations that you have and the conversations that you host and hold space for, amazing, right? So there's lots of value in those.
Right.
And I'm a big believer that if you continue to do things that add value, right, like there's a reward that comes back for you.
Yeah.
And so I then would my advice, I guess, would be to continue to look for the reward, because it might look different each time, right? It might not look like, hey, here's a check, you know, but it might look like an opportunity or, you know, something, and it might just elevate your voice. It might bring you financial success. It might be, you know, a partnership or you know, whatever it is, or it might be an opportunity to, you know, develop a line of, you know, beverages or like do plant touching things. And then you kind of create those parts of your business and you use all the different parts of your business to amplify each other, right? In the same way that like we're all in the same industry and we want to amplify each other. Like I want to support you and amplify you, and I appreciate your support, and it works.
Reciprocal relationships and always growing at the same time. Yeah.
And people underestimate, I think, the value of media and the breadth of media, like that it encompasses so much, but everybody has a story, right? And every collective of people have their own stories, and there's value in those and telling them.
We appreciate you being on the podcast and sharing your story, Colin. That's really nice.
For those looking to connect with you a little bit more, maybe they want to follow up or keep having this conversation, where would you recommend to send them?
Yeah, best place probably LinkedIn. Cool. Colin Kelley.
Perfect. We'll link that in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect.
Ian, 2 E's and Kelley.
Yeah. 1 L and Colin, 2 E's and Kelley. You know, efficient and not efficient. Yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you again, Colin, so much for coming on, sharing your past, sharing a little bit of your expertise, and appreciate looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks.